They told them it was iron. Bright bottles lined the laboratory shelf, each marked with a precise chemical formula, each promising health. Pregnant women arrived at the clinic, routine in their expectation. Nutrition advice, a small vial of supplement, a careful record of their intake. But the ledgers, the manifests, the carefully filed correspondence tell another story. Between 1945 and 1947, a protocol was enacted at Vanderbilt University that would come to define the boundary between scientific inquiry and ethical responsibility. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. Post-war America was a nation newly conscious of atomic power. The Manhattan Project had closed its doors, leaving behind a cadre of scientists, engineers, and bureaucrats steeped in both ambition and secrecy. The promise of nuclear energy was entwined with national pride, scientific prestige, and an untested frontier of human experimentation. Medical institutions, historically steeped in tradition, were suddenly part of a network that extended from university laboratories to federal research offices. At the center of this network, the so-called nutrition study presented itself as ordinary. Pregnant mothers received iron supplements, a simple, healthful intervention. The language in consent forms was cautious, almost perfunctory. In practice, these forms rarely mentioned that the iron was, in certain cases, radioactive. A select cohort of participants, perhaps a handful in each clinic, was administered a tracer dose of Fe-59, an isotope intended to track the metabolism of iron through the mother and, subsequently, the infant. The purpose, as written in the now declassified memoranda, was data. Purely data. Observational records of absorption rates, cellular uptake, and longitudinal monitoring. Yet the emotional weight is inescapable. Mothers trusted the clinic, the physicians, the university. They were not volunteers in a Cold War experiment, they were participants in what they understood to be routine care. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. The study itself, when isolated from its context, seems clinical, almost antiseptic. But the surrounding architecture, the federal oversight, the funding streams, the advisory committees, reveals a broader intention. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, newly formed in 1946, supplied grants and guidance. Their focus was nuclear knowledge, yet the methods they funded often intersected with human bodies in subtle, unpublicized ways. Hospital intake logs show meticulous care in one domain and a conspicuous absence in another. Informed consent forms were present, but the radioactive tracers were not mentioned explicitly. Lab notations described doses, isotopic purity, and measurement schedules with exacting detail. Children born to these mothers were followed with regular blood sampling. These records, now carefully cataloged in federal archives, reveal the cumulative exposure and trace data collected over months and years. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. Financial oversight was equally meticulous. Budgets listed the costs of isotopic production, shipping, laboratory staffing, and clinical administration. Inflation-adjusted figures show that the experiment was a considerable federal investment, a small yet precise fraction of post-war atomic research funding. Academic correspondence, preserved in the vaults of the university, demonstrates a constant dialogue between principal investigators and the federal authorities. The language is bureaucratic, careful, measured. Success metrics were scientific, yet ethical concerns were rarely foregrounded. Documents from the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, convened in the 1990s, dissected these files. They noted, repeatedly, the absence of full disclosure. They cataloged every dose, every signed consent form, every memorandum from the Atomic Energy Commission. The committee found that, by today's standards, the study would be untenable. By the standards of 1945, however, it was permissible. The legal and ethical frameworks were in transition. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. Federal review reports included recommendations for monitoring, post hoc notification, and compensation. Indeed, in the late 1990s, surviving participants and their families received settlements. When adjusted for inflation, the disbursements represent hundreds of thousands of dollars, acknowledging not only financial loss, but the breach of trust. Yet trust is not quantifiable. Trust, once fractured, leaves its mark on the social fabric, on the perception of institutional reliability, on the willingness of citizens to participate in collective scientific endeavors. The children, their growth charts, their blood work, their medical follow-ups, all these traces form a secondary archive. They are living records of human curiosity, ambition, and oversight. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. The hospital, the university, the federal agencies all were actors in a system that prized data above disclosure. Each step was logged, coded, archived, yet human experience, subjective and emotive, often resided outside the ledger. Sensory records survived too. The faint metallic smell of laboratory vials, the cold fluorescence of hospital wards, the careful scratching of pens on ledger pages, dust particles caught in sunbeams, rusting filing cabinets, the faint hum of ventilation, these are the textures of history. A reconstructed timeline demonstrates the interweaving of bureaucracy and biology. The first intake, January 1945. The final collection of blood samples, December 1947. Meetings with EC officers, laboratory reports, internal reviews, and memos all fill the intervening years. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. Post-war America was a society in flux. The atomic age promised power and knowledge, yet its promise carried unforeseen obligations. The Vanderbilt nutrition study exemplifies the tension between discovery and discretion, between innovation and empathy. Declassified communications show careful attention to outcomes, but less to human experience. Principles discussed isotopic decay, statistical significance, absorption rates, but rarely documented the mother's understanding or consent. Still, the institutional memory was preserved. Files remained in archives. Ledgers were never destroyed. A pattern existed, visible to those willing to examine it. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. In the 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, federal review panels revisited the case. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments cataloged each study, each participant, each report. Their conclusion: lessons had to be institutionalized. Ethics boards, informed consent doctrine, IRBs, the scaffolding of modern research were in part a response to these protocols. The legacy of the study is dual. On one hand, a cautionary tale. On the other, a foundation for oversight, accountability, and the codification of trust. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. Modern bioethics relies on this history. Hospitals, universities, and federal agencies are bound by procedural frameworks designed to prevent recurrence. Scientific progress is no longer measured only by data acquired, but by the consent and understanding of those who participate. Every ledger, every signature, every experimental log is a vestige, a memory encoded in paper, ink, and institutional practice. Dust settles over it, yet the pattern remains. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. The Vanderbilt nutrition study, once obscure, now sits in public consciousness as both warning and guide. Pregnant women, children, mothers, and bureaucrats all exist within the shadows of these records, reminding us that human curiosity and institutional ambition are inseparable from ethical responsibility. Erased Fortunes preserves this archive. We illuminate what was once hidden in filing cabinets, behind locked doors, and beneath layers of bureaucratic language. We trace the trajectory of policy, procedure, and human experience. We document the ledger entries, the budget tables, the isotopic reports, the advisory committee reviews. We recount the narrative not as accusation, but as forensic reconstruction. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. The story does not end in 1947. It echoes into the present day, influencing regulations, medical school curricula, ethical committees, and patient consent. Each modern practitioner owes, in part, their guidance to the lessons embedded in these archives. By reconstructing the narrative of the Vanderbilt nutrition study, we confront the paradox of progress, knowledge gained at the expense of transparency, advancement shadowed by oversight, discovery interwoven with human consequence. The metallic vials, the ledger pages, the dust motes in sunbeams, all speak if one listens closely. They recount a history measured in data points and human lives, in cautious memoranda and forgotten footsteps along hospital corridors. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol. A pattern. As the Cold War receded and the atomic age matured, the protocols of the past became case studies for education, reflection, and moral consideration. The women, the children, the laboratories, the universities, they remained the silent witnesses to a pattern that was precise, methodical, and ultimately instructive. Erased Fortunes keeps these witnesses alive. Through archives, imagery, and narrative, we restore visibility to what was once obscured, revealing not scandal for its own sake, but the architecture of history itself. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern. The study is now a chapter in the history of science, a lesson in ethics, and a mirror reflecting the responsibilities of institutions toward human lives. We close this investigation with the understanding that the ledger never lies, the archives endure, and the pattern once hidden is now visible. Erased Fortunes preserves the ledger. We illuminate the trace. We reveal the protocol. We follow the pattern. And in doing so, we honor both the human lives recorded within and the structural lessons their experience imparted. It wasn't an error, it was a protocol, a pattern,